13th tribe, the Khazar Empire, and its heritage.
Exodus. The evidence quoted in the previous pages indicates that, contrary to the traditional view held by 9th, 10th century historians, the Khazars, after the defeat by the Russians in 965, lost their empire but retained their independence within narrower frontiers and their Judaic faith. Well into the 13th century, they even seem to have reverted to some extent to their erstwhile predatory habits. Barron comments, in general, the reduced Khazar kingdom persevered. It waged a more or less effective defense against all foes until the middle of the 13th century, when it fell victim to the great Mongol invasion set in motion by Genghis Khan. Even then, it resisted stubbornly until the surrender of all its neighbors. Its population was largely absorbed by the Golden Horde, which had established the center of its empire in Khazar territory. But before and after the Mongol upheaval, the Khazars sent many offshoots into the unsubdued Slavonic lands, helping ultimately to build up the great Jewish centers of Eastern Europe. Here, then, we have the cradle of the numerically strongest and culturally dominant part of modern Jewry. The offshoots to which Barron refers were indeed branching out long before the destruction of the Khazar state by the Mongols, as the ancient Hebrew nation had started branching into the diaspora long before the destruction of Jerusalem. Ethnically, the Semitic tribes on the waters of the Jordan and the Turco-Khazar tribes on the Volga were, of course, miles apart. But they had at least two important formative factors in common. Each lived at a focal junction where the great trade routes connected east and west, north and south intersect, a circumstance which predisposed them to become nations of traders, of enterprising travelers, or rootless cosmopolitans, as hostile propaganda has unaffectionately labeled them. But at the same time, their exclusive religion fostered a tendency to keep to themselves and stick together, to establish their own communities with their own places of worship, schools, residential quarters, and ghettos, originally self-imposed in whatever town or country they settled. This rare combination of wanderlust and ghetto mentality, reinforced by messianic hopes and chosen race pride, both ancient Israelites and medieval Khazars shared, even though the later traced their descendants not to Shem, but to Japheth. This development is well illustrated by what one might call the Khazar diaspora in Hungary. We remember that long before the destruction of their state, several Khazar tribes known as the Kabars joined the Magyars and migrated to Hungary. Moreover, in the 10th century, the Hungarian Duke Taxoni invited a second wave of Khazar immigrants to settle in his domains. 2 centuries later, John Cinemas, The Byzantine chronicler mentions troops observing the Jewish law, fighting with the Hungarian army in Dalmatia in 1154. There may have been small numbers of real Jews living in Hungary from Roman days, but there can be little doubt that the majority of this important portion of modern Jewry originated in the migratory waves of Khazars, who play such a dominant part in early Hungarian history. Not only was the country, as Constantine tells us, bilingual at its beginning, but it also had a form of double kingship, a variation of the Khazar system, the king sharing power with his general in command, who bore the title of Gyula or Gyula, still a popular Hungarian first name. The system lasted to the end of the 10th century, when Saint Stephen embraced the Roman Catholic faith and defeated a rebellious Gyula, who, as one might expect, was a Khazar, vain in the faith and refusing to become a Christian. This episode puts an end to the double kingship, but not to the influence of the Khazar Jewish community in Hungary. A reflection of that influence can be found in the Golden Bull, the Hungarian equivalent of Magna Carta, issued 1222 by King Andrew II, in which Jews were forbidden to act as mint masters, tax collectors, and controllers of the royal salt monopoly, indicating that before the edict, numerous Jews must have held these important posts. But they occupied even more exalted positions. King Indri's custodian of the revenues of the royal chamber were the Chamberlain Count Teka, a Jew of Khazar origin, a rich landowner, and apparently a financial and diplomatic genius. His signature appears on various peace treaties and financial agreements, among them one guaranteeing the payment of 2,000 marks by the Austrian ruler Leopold II to the King of Hungary. One is irresistibly reminded of a similar role played by the Spanish Jew Hasadi ibn Shaprut at the court of the Caliph of Cordoba. Comparing similar episodes from the Palestinian diaspora in the West and the Khazar diaspora in the East of Europe makes the analog between them appear perhaps less tenuous. It is also worth mentioning that when King Indri was compelled by his rebellious nobles to issue, reluctantly, the Golden Bull, he kept Teka in office against the bull's express provisions. The royal chamberlain held his post happily for another 11 years until papal pressure on the king made it advisable for Teka to resign and betake himself to Austria, where he was received with open arms. However, King Indri's son, Bela IV, obtained papal permission to call him back. Teka duly returned and perished during the Mongol invasion. The Khazar origin of the numerically and socially dominant element in the Jewish population of Hungary during the Middle Ages is thus relatively well documented. It might seem that Hungary constitutes a special case in view of the early Magyar-Khazar connection. But, in fact, the Khazar influx into Hungary was merely a part of the general mass migration from the Eurasian steppes towards the west, towards Central and Eastern Europe. The Khazars were not the only nations which sent offshoots into Hungary. Thus, large numbers of the self-same Pichengians who had chased the Magyars from the Don across the Carpathians were forced to ask for permission to settle in Hungarian territory when they in turn were chased by the Cumans, and the Cumans shared the same fate when, a century later, they fled from the Mongols, and some 40,000 of them, with their slaves, were granted asylum by the Hungarian King Bela. At relatively quiescent times, this general westward movement of the Eurasian population was no more than a drift. At other times, it became a stampede. But the consequences of the Mongol invasion must rank on this metaphoric scale as an earthquake followed by a landslide. The warriors of Chief Tejuman, called Genghis Khan, Lord of the Earth, massacred the population of whole cities as a warning to others not to resist. Used prisoners as living screens in front of their advancing lines, destroyed the irrigation network of the Volga Delta, which had provided the Khazar lands with rice and other staple foods, and transformed the fertile steppes into wild fields, Daikoyi Pole, as the Russians were later to call them. An unlimited space without farmers or shepherds, through which only mercenary horsemen pass in the service of this or that rival ruler or people escaping from such rule. The Black Death of 1347 through 1348 accelerated the progressive depopulation of the former Khazar heartland between Caucasus, Don, and Volga, where the steppe culture had reached its highest level, and relapse into barbarism was, by contrast, more drastic than in adjoining regions. As Barron wrote, the destruction or departure of industrious Jewish farmers, artisans, and merchants left behind a void, which in those regions has only recently begun to be filled. Not only Khazaria was destroyed, but also the Volga-Bulgar country, together with the last Caucasian strongholds of the Alans and Cumans, and the southern Russian principalities, including Kiev. During the period of disintegration of the Golden Horde from the 14th century onward, the anarchy became, if possible, even worse. In most of the European steppes, immigration was the only way left open for populations who wanted to secure their lives and livelihood. The migration towards safer pastures was a protracted, intermediate process which went on for several centuries. The Khazar exodus was part of the general picture. It had been preceded, as earlier mentioned, by the founding of Khazar colonies and settlements in various places in the Ukraine and southern Russia. There was a flourishing Jewish community in Kiev long before and after the Rus took the town from the Khazars. Similar colonies existed in Peroslavl, and Chernigov. A rabbi, Moshe of Kiev, studied in France around 1160, and a rabbi, Abraham of Chersigov, studied in 1181 in the Talmud School of London. The Lay of Igor's Host mentions as a famous contemporary Russian poet called Kogan, possibly a combination of Kohen, priest, and Kagan, sometime after Sarkel, which the Russians called Biela Veza, was destroyed. The Khazars built a town of the same name near Chernigov. There is an ambience of ancient place names in the Ukraine and Poland which derive from Khazar or Zahid, Jew, Zidoo, Korzarzoek, Khazara, Khazarzo, Zidowaska, Vola, Zidaisi, and so on. They may have once been villages or just temporary encampments of Khazar Jewish communities on their long trek to the west. Similar place names can also be found in the Carpathian and Tatra mountains, and in the eastern provinces of Austria. Even the ancient Jewish cemeteries of Krakow and Zandomirs, both called Kavaiori, are assumed to be of Khazar origin. While the main route of the Khazar exodus led to the west, some groups of people were left behind, mainly in the Crimea and the Caucasus, where they formed Jewish enclaves surviving into modern times. In the ancient Khazar stronghold of Tamataraka, Taman, facing the Crimea across the Straits of Kerch, we hear of a dynasty of Jewish princes who ruled in the 15th century under the tutelage of the Genovese Republic, and later of the Crimean Tartars. The last of them, Prince Zachariah, conducted negotiations with the Prince of Muscovy, who invited Zachariah to come to Russia and to let himself be baptized in exchange for receiving the privileges of a Russian nobleman. Zachariah refused, but Paul Ika has suggested that in other cases, the introduction of Khazar Jewish elements into exalted positions in the Muscovite states may have been one of the factors which led to the appearance of the Jewish heresy, Zidovast Bayuzhitchik, among Russian priests and noblemen of the 16th century and of the sect of Sabbath observers, Subbotatniki, which is still widespread among Cossacks and peasants. Another vestige of the Khazar nation are the mountain Jews in the northeastern Caucasus, who apparently stayed behind in their original habitats when the others left. They are supposed to be numbered around 8,000 and live in the vicinity of other tribal remnants of the olden days, Kipchaks and Oghuz. They call themselves Da Chufuti, Highland Jews, in the Tat language which they have adopted from another Caucasian tribe, but little else is known about them. Other Khazar enclaves have survived in the Crimea, and no doubt elsewhere too, in localities which once belonged to their empire. But these are now no more than historic curios compared to the mainstream of the Khazar migration into the Polish, Lithuanian regions. and the formidable problems it poses to historians and anthropologists. The regions in Eastern Central Europe in which the Jewish immigrants from Khazar found a new home and apparent safety had only begun to assume political importance towards the end of the first millennium. Around 962, several Slavonic tribes formed an allegiance under the leadership of the strongest among them, the Polans, which became the nucleus of the Polish state. Thus, the Polish rise to eminence started about the same time as the Khazar decline. Sarkel was destroyed in 965. It is significant that Jews play an important role in one of the earliest Polish legions relating to the foundation of the Polish kingdom. We are told that when the allied tribes decided to elect a king to rule them all, they chose a Jew named Abraham Prokonik. He may have been a rich and educated Khazar merchant from whose experience the Slav backwoodsmen hoped to benefit, or just a legendary figure. But, if so, the legend indicates that Jews of this type were held in high esteem. At any rate, as the story goes on, Abraham, with unwanted modesty, resigned the crown in favor of a native peasant named Piast, who thus became the founder of the historic Piast dynasty, which ruled Poland from about 962 to 1370. Whether Abraham Prokonik existed or not, there are plenty of indications that the Jewish immigrants from Khazar were welcome as a valuable asset to the country's economy and government administration. The Poles, under the Piast dynasty and their Baltic neighbors, the Lithuanians, had rapidly expanded their frontiers and were in dire need of immigrants to colonize their territories and to create an urban civilization. They encouraged, first, the immigration of German peasants, burghers, and craftsmen, and later of immigrants from the territories occupied by the Golden Horde, including Armenians, Southern Slavs, and Khazars. Not all these migrations were voluntary. They included large numbers of prisoners of war, such as Crimean Tartars, who were put to cultivate the estates of Lithuanians and Polish landlords in the conquered southern provinces. At the close of the 14th century, the Lithuanian principality stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But in the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks, conquerors of Byzantium, advanced northward, and the landlords transferred the people from their estates in the border areas further inland. Among the population thus forcibly transferred was a strong contingent of Karaites, the fundamentalist Jewish sect which rejected rabbinical learning. According to a tradition which has survived among Karaites into modern times, their ancestors were brought to Poland by the great Lithuanian warrior prince Witold at the end of the 14th century as prisoners of war from Sulkat in the Crimea. In favor of this tradition speaks the fact that Witold in 1388 granted a charter of rights to the Jews of Troki, and the French traveler de Lannoy found there a great number of Jews speaking a different language from the Germans and natives. That language was, and still is, a Turkish dialect. In fact, the nearest among living languages to the lingua cumanica, which was spoken in the former Khazar territories at the time of the Golden Horde. According to Zajakowski, this language is still used in speech and prayer in the surviving Karaites communities in Troki, Vilna, Ponevez, Lutsk, and Halich. The Karaites also claim that before the Great Plague of 1710, they had some 32 or 37 communities in Poland and Lithuania. They call their ancient dialect the language of Khazar, just as Rabbi Pachia in the 12th century called their habitat north of the Black Sea the land of the Khazar. And what he has to say about them, sitting in the dark through the Sabbath, ignorance of rabbinical learning, fits their sectarian attitude. Accordingly, Zajakowski, the eminent contemporary Turkologist, considers the Karaites, from their linguistic point of view, as the purest present-day representatives of the ancient Khazars. About the reason why this sect preserved this language for about half a millennium, while the main body of Khazar Jews shed it in favor of the Yiddish lingua franca, more will have to be said later.